Okay, so I want to welcome you back. Today, we have Jared Korver talking to us about two different concepts, the FAIRS economy, or a fear-based economy, and God's economy, and how those things from the text inform a lot, the Bible, inform a lot about life today. And I want to welcome you that you have come. We've been talking about how the coronavirus and fear affect very much our attitudes and environment, and how we should think about that from a gospel point of view, how we should recalibrate, how we should allow God's grace to allow us to calm the panic and allow us to think creatively in order to be able to serve people well. So on Monday, we talked a little bit about that, just general concept. On Tuesday, we went specifically in the Enneagram and talked about different stressors for people. Yesterday, we had a great conversation on leading others through a time of fear. And then today, we're going to talk about what I just said, God's economy versus Pharaoh's economy, or a fear-based economy. As we get going, if you have questions, type them in the chat, and then we'll stop every once in a while to answer those. So I want to just invite Jared Korver on here. Jared is a friend that goes to church, and he taught some things that all my old training just started clicking in, and it really made a lot of sense, and I think it helped a lot for me. So Jared, if you won't mind just kind of introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So my name is Jared Korver. I am a product of small town North Carolina. Grew up in the Pinehurst area in a little town called Carthage. The son of a preacher, and in the middle of two sisters and a mother who lovingly homeschooled me for several years before I made that impossible for her. And I'm a C.P.A. by trade, and a certified financial planner. So that's what I do for a living. I'm married to Amy, and we have two boys, Miles and Charlie, and are currently trying to figure out this new normal, and hopefully it won't be a normal for a long period of time, but we're hunkering down.
So you spend most of your day doing now, like maybe halfway taking care of kids, but most of your day doing wealth management, advisement, those kind of things.
That's correct.
Also teach them, right?
Yep. So John, you mentioned that we did a Sunday school class at church in January, February, and it was about 6 or 7 weeks long. And I led it with one of the clergy at our church who is getting his PhD in Old Testament. And it was really a fun exercise, but also a formative exercise for us to come at it from our two areas of interest and expertise. So yeah, it was a fun time, and I really have found it formative for our lives, my family, and trying to put some of it into practice. So it is fun to be able to teach from time to time.
For sure. So you do wealth management. What's this last week or two been for you and all of your clients?
Yeah. It's been hard. We one of the ways that I hope my faith comes to bear on my profession is in the teaching that I'm able and coaching people through these events before they happen. And obviously I didn't know there was going to be a global virus spreading around the world, but part of my job is to teach people that no matter how much good planning you do, we can't control outcomes. We can't, there's very little that we can control, and those are the behaviors that we engage in, and let's focus on those and the process of planning and hold loosely the outcome. And so this is clearly a time to practice the holding loosely of outcomes. And so it is stressful. I mean, I think it's sort of bifurcated in terms of the response that I get when I talk to clients. Clearly, it means something very different for somebody who's retired or almost retired than it does for somebody who's got a runway ahead of them. So there's a lot of just listening and trying to be present to people in these moments. And it's just very strange because generally when we have a bear market or something that impacts people to this extent, it's not also accompanied by this sort of everyday change of being holed up in your house because of a pandemic. And so having both of those together, I think, has been probably the hardest part, in that, you know, if you think of the typical coping mechanisms for difficulty, financially or otherwise, a lot of that is social, and we get together in community. And so having to figure out ways to do that, you know, on a computer or a phone or otherwise is tough. But yeah, it's been a tough time, but also I think a good opportunity just to be present in people's lives.
Yeah, for sure. I imagine not only just from the stock market having trouble, but people are already probably picking up the phone in fear to you just from the nature of the virus and the threat of that. So it sounds like just a really good time to be in your, not financially, but it sounds like a really good time emotionally and spiritually to be, you know, engaged in people's lives.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about, why don't you lay out a little bit for us what you've observed on and from a fear-based economy, or really what you more specifically said, Pharaoh's economy versus God's economy. And I put up your ideas here on a slide that whenever you do, I can put it up on the screen.
Cool.
So but explain that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So as we were preparing the Sunday school class, I love reading. I'm a bibliophile of sorts. And Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, he is phenomenal on anything Old Testament, but he wrote a book a few years ago called Money and Possessions, which I read probably 18 months ago. And in that book, he does a really, I think, important work of showing us the choice in the latter part of Genesis and Exodus before us of, are you going to choose Pharaoh's ways, or are you going to choose Yahweh's ways? And even in the book of Joshua, there's sort of this stark call to action of choose this day whom you will serve. And so a lot of Brueggemann's ideas have been really formative in the way that I think about money and economics and the people of God. And so when I was trying to distill some of that into this class that we taught at church, it was helpful for me to boil it down to these topics. I've got 6 of them for each. So I sort of, for Pharaoh, and you see this, you know, we think of Pharaoh as entering the narrative in Exodus, but he really starts at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 47, when he realizes that a famine is coming upon the land, and immediately, and you even see before that in the way that he interacts with Joseph and the dreams and all that, that he's a fearful person, which is typical of people in that seat of power. And so when he hears that a famine is coming, his first reaction is to bring all of the food in the kingdom into a centralized location. And we see in Genesis 47 that through a series of transactions, and it's very odd as you read it, you don't necessarily feel the gravity of it on first reading, but through a series of transactions, the people of God become enslaved. First, Pharaoh gives them food in exchange for all the money in the land. Once all the money in the land is gone, then he goes with the livestock. So the livestock are given as collateral in order for food to be distributed. And then finally, the land and then the bodies. So the people are basically giving themselves as collateral for food. And that leads to the people of Israel being enslaved. And so that mode, the Pharaoh's economy, and we'll probably talk later about how that's not just endemic to Pharaoh in Egypt. It's something that's very much at play today, but it starts from fear, and you'll probably have to see this. And then from fear, you get anxiety. And in anxiety, I sort of think of that as different from fear, because anxiety to me exudes this idea of sort of a nervous energy of this, of you acting out in ways that are not passive. And so his anxiety was what caused him to bring all the food into a centralized location and then to start kind of meeting it out centrally. The anxiety leads to this worldview of scarcity. So he's thinking famine means that God's world is not good enough, that there's not enough to go around. And therefore, the scarcity mindset leads him to, enslave the people. And even as we see in the book of Exodus, as Moses is trying to liberate his people, there's this idea of like continued and increasing performative measures that Pharaoh puts on the slaves. And so he's, making them either increase the quota of bricks, or he's removing raw materials from the process to make it harder. That performance leads to burnout, clearly. And there's this, when I talked about this in the Sunday school class, when I use the word burnout, I think that's a giant euphemism, because for the slaves in Egypt, burnout was either death, which we'll get to, but it was more than just the psychological torment. It was this deep-seated emotional toil and heartache that led to them, to cry out to Yahweh to rescue them. And then, the end goal, maybe not goal, but the end product of Pharaoh's economy is death. So you start with fear, you move into this nervous anxiety, which leads you to believe that the world is scarce. Then you are continually kind of running in the rat race of performance, which ultimately leads to burnout and then to death. And then, Yahweh is the very opposite in every move. We see it in Genesis 1 and all the way through, that the world that God made was good. And it didn't stop being good when sin entered the world. Even when God called Abraham and Sarah, there's almost this embarrassment of riches, of where he's blessing Abraham and Sarah with a child in their absurdly old age. And he tells them that he's going to bless them so that they can be a blessing. And he his love is what caused him to work into a creative way. And so his love led him into creativity. So he made the world and continues to be creative in the way he works. That world is abundant, and we see that throughout the biblical narrative. And when we live in that abundance, we work not out of a performance paradigm, but in covenant, a relationship with God. So God works with his people. He calls us to action, but he's also the one who's enabling us to do that through his Spirit. Then there's this stark contrast in burnout and rest. God has built Sabbath rest into the entire created order, as opposed to being a reward for your performance or something else. It's actually the basis for our relationship and our covenantal action. And then all that obviously culminates in life. The resurrection of Jesus was this, the inauguration of a kingdom that's based on life, that sort of was the final stamp on God's creative juices flowing from the very beginning to bring about abundant life.
Mm-hmm.
So those are, those 6 items, and each of those are helpful for me because we can place ourselves anywhere on that, timeline, if you will. It's not a linear thing necessarily, and see where we might have gotten off track. I'm tempted. Performance is a tough one for me. I can get caught up thinking that my worth is tied to how well I do a job, or how many people I do the job for, or whatever. But so that's kind of the main thing that I was teaching there, in the context of, if we're going to think about money and possessions as Christians, we have to start from the question, well, who is God? And God is, we can easily give pat answers around God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but the way we live our lives would often deny that fact, and actually suggest that the God we're serving on a day-to-day basis is more like Pharaoh than Yahweh. And so that, that was kind of the beginning of that.
That's good. So let me put it all together, because I think when you see it all together, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about Pharaoh, about the contrast here. So as he said, Pharaoh's economy starts with fear, goes towards anxiety. He mentioned scarcity, performance, and burnout and death. Now that is the actual very different. There's a war going on basically between Pharaoh and God, and Genesis and Exodus, and because Pharaoh was regarded as a god, and so God's economy is going this way, as he just described: love to creativity to abundance, the covenant, rest, and life. And I can obviously see how obviously death and life, or burnout and rest, are contrary to each other. But describe some of these, and even some of the earlier ones. Describe some of these. Jared, of like scarcity or abundance makes sense, but performance, why is covenant opposite of that in particular?
That's a great question. So when I think of performance, I think that the product of my body or my mind, what I do vocationally, or even through play or leisure, that it is the product of what I do that matters in the grand scheme of things to my worth. And so it's allowing the product of myself to define me, as opposed to, in covenant, God. And this is where it's hard to pull out these things because they're so interconnected. But if I've started from a place of love, and I believe that God, as in 1 John 4, it says, God is love, and in him there is no darkness. Like, if we start from there and know that God's love for us is unending, and that he has chosen to enter into covenant with us to do something, that it is God's love and creativity of me, that I'm a son of God. That is what gives me worth. That God has said I have worth is all that gives me worth. And so when I think about covenant, it's not that in God's economy there's no work to do. Quite the opposite. In fact, much of the reason that the church has gotten into so much trouble is we have said that the job of the church is just to go to heaven, as opposed to doing something in the intervening time. And so that the covenant of God draws us to accomplish his good purposes in the redemption of all things, through our vocation, through our family, through, and of course, the way we spend money. So when I think of covenant, the product of what I do is important, because I believe God has called us to a higher purpose of being agents of his resurrection power here and now. But that product doesn't then retroactively define who I am, because I've started from hopefully a place of love and situated in the stillness and the foundational knowledge that God sees me as his own. When you think of like where that would be in Pharaoh's economy, the people of Israel were enslaved. Their bodies were worth nothing. Their lives were worth nothing. They were a commodity to be traded just like a pig or a cow or anything. And so those in the modern day, clearly we don't think of ourselves as commodities in that same way. But when you're forced to be, emailing people at 10:30 at night, or you have to pick up and move your family at a moment's notice for a job, or you are working 90 hours a week in a law firm or an accounting firm, you start to see that there's way more, there's a lot more similarity between now and Pharaoh's economy than we may be comfortable admitting to ourselves.
Yeah, there is a lot more similarity. I'm gonna take down this slide here in a second. So if you want to write it down, go ahead and do that. There is a lot of similarity. The thing that really brought it to mind for me was the cosmic nature of things that can often still be displayed. I mean, you look at the news right now; it's pretty clear the Federal Reserve Chairman or the politicians are not in charge. It's the economic forces. And even some of those war type or spiritual terminology, there is a recognition even from a secular state that this is beyond us. There is a cosmic battle going on, and what really defines us. And obviously you can just look at Pharaoh's economy right now and think, gosh, man, are we there?
Yeah.
I mean, fear and anxiety and scarcity and performance and burnout and death. I mean, this is this is a trap for many of us, and all of us, somewhere in here. That a lot of times that fear and anxiety could be most felt right now. But even if you're trying to provide for other people that are working for you, or be able to still keep rolling for the future of your income, performance is something that you're fighting in a cosmic battle. You're just one soldier in a whole group of forces that are beyond our control. And it doesn't take you long if we kept on going, especially add on the social distancing aspect from a social standpoint, of us just relying on our grit to be able to pull ourselves out of this, something that very much can come to mind. So how else is it especially, I'm going to stop this, how else is it especially instructive for us today? Jared, what else comes to your mind?
Well, when I think when Yahweh liberates his people from Egypt, I think it's incredibly instructive that he doesn't take them to the promised land right away. He takes 40 years to teach them an alternative economics. 40 years in the desert. By the way, to just hammer in the third thing of abundance and creativity and all this, he brings them into the desert and provides manna for them every day for 40 years. So he's taken them out of the foremost empire in the world where all the wealth and all of the resources are situated. And he brings them into the desert, and then he shows them, this is kind of like Paul, my power is made perfect in your weakness. That when the very place they thought that scarcity was most salient, that it was most real, then they woke up 6 days a week with bread on the ground that they had nothing to do with. And so he's already unlearning the people of Israel the lessons they had kind of embodied in Egypt. And then after that 40-year process of unlearning and he brings them into the promised land, he gives them this alternative set of economics. And I think that's what's really instructive to us is as we sit in as Christians with sort of one foot in Pharaoh's economy and one foot in Yahweh's economy, like we can't pull ourselves out, like we can't just not participate, but we have been given a set of practices to help us to do so in ways that are still covenantal, that are still partnering with God in his work. And so like, to me, and we talked about this in the Sunday school class, to me, those practices are tithing, Sabbath, and hospitality. When you look at the Old Testament in the law that was given to Moses, economics are at the center of the entire thing. So Sabbath, all the Sabbath laws were centered around this rhythm of work and rest and of creating margin, of using land in wise ways, of not allowing wealth to accumulate indefinitely. You know, they would have this every 7 years, your debts would go to zero and you start over. Every 50th year, all the land in Jubilee would go back to its original owner. You have the tithe. The tithe is, I mean, we could talk for an hour on the tithe itself, but the 10% given as a reminder that God is the one who has given you, you know, in Deuteronomy 8, it says that God is the one who's given you the power to get wealth, and don't forget that. And so a tithe is a way to remember. Then hospitality, which I think gets super interesting in the world of social distancing. Hospitality is defined in the Old Testament not as having your friends over all the time, which is fine, but in opening up your door and your pocketbook to the stranger, to the immigrant, to the poor and the widow, the orphan. And so to me, that's the three-legged stool of this is, as the people of God, can we trust God enough to believe that we can stop working in Sabbath, that we could choose to give away at least 10% of our money off the top, and that we could open up our doors, either hopefully literally in a time that we're not in a pandemic, but in creative ways during social distancing eras, opening up our doors to the stranger. Those are ways to me that, again, we can't not participate in 2020 capitalistic American economy. It's what it is. But I think if we begin to embody the three practices that those three practices set out in the Old Testament and embodied by Jesus and his disciples in the early church, we'll start to realize that we've given the world something to think about, that there's maybe a different reality and a higher reality going on that leads to life instead of death. I think that's probably the thing is just not only in the liberation of God's people from Egypt, but how Yahweh then went about sort of tearing down that old paradigm and giving them a new one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting because they're being delivered from the strongest economy in the world's ever seen at that point. And what they learn is that this fear-based place where they had tons was actually not as not really what they've been looking for all along, you know. And of course, they live not just paycheck to paycheck, but breadcrumb to breadcrumb, you know. While they all of a sudden learn about the gift of grace, of relationship, of abundance, of participating with God. Even when I think about the temple and how God used creativity and the different people's skills and crafts in order to create something beautiful. And then, of course, as you're mentioning with the tithe, just and hospitality, just being completely generous, moving people to a generous place because of the assurance of abundance and love and covenant. There's a lot there. Obviously, we don't know where we are economically, and not necessarily saying we're going to a desert right now. You know, we need to learn how to, you know, suck it up and be generous. It's not that at all. It's quite the opposite. It's that I think that it's just highlighting the fact that we can right now really realize that we can operate in light of God's economy today, even while others are operating in a different place. Now, what are some personal ways that that some of this has changed your mindset towards this concept?
I think, to me, my training, I got 2 degrees in accounting and took a lot of economics classes in college, and
Mhm.
in finance is what I do now. The basis of economics, as most people learn it, is scarcity. That is taken as a incontrovertible fact.
Yes.
And I think that has been the most formative thing to me, is attempting to spend each day trusting that God has made enough. And
Hmm.
um, what that does in me is it helps me to have open hands with what I have.
Yeah.
Um, because if one of the things that it means when you believe that God has made enough for everyone is that you also then realize God didn't make too much for everyone. And when I am tempted to believe that the world is scarce, it is easy for me to be grabbing on to too much, to things I don't need, to things I don't particularly even want. But when I believe that God's world is abundant, it makes me realize what is actually important. What can I give away? Because there are those who, for various reasons in our, Pharaoh-like economy, have not been able to participate. Um,
Hmm.
so that, I think, is the biggest one, is and the hardest one in a lot of ways, because it is a daily matter of trust. I've got clients now who are dealing with, like, is there going to be enough? And that is where the rubber meets the road, in terms of believing that God has made abundance, but also as the church embodying it, and making space for the church to provide for each other's needs in a time where they will clearly be brought to light.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in a wealthy family, and we lost everything we owned. And my mom just worried. She worried before we lost it all, that we were going to lose it all, because it was more than money. It was connection to her
Mm,
parents, and also just a way to provide for people that we employed, for sure. And so I think, most of it was a mixed bag. But then she worried when we lost it, we lost it all. And yet, when the day she died, I remember walking out, and after just grieving for a while, just being really struck of God took care of her every step
mm,
of the way.
mm,
And yet at the same time,
mm.
I could totally worry and, get all up and worried about things. So I can see it. How does this, if we are really operating though from a place of God's economy, and realizing that God's got us, He's transferred us, He's rescued us from the dominion of darkness, and He's transferred us into the kingdom of His beloved Son. How can we, from a generosity standpoint, what are some practical ways we can be generous to people that are getting anxious and caught up in fear as well? What's come to mind on that for you?
Yeah, I think the first thing is listening, and presence and compassion. When I think of compassion, it means to suffer with somebody. And so I think the first step is always to be open to hearing that people are suffering,
Yeah.
and to understand uh, the depth of that suffering to the best we can, and being empathetic. Um, in terms of actions, I think that the best way is for churches to do this corporately for their own body, to
Mhm.
make it a normative thing in churches, that if people are struggling, it is made known to the whole body. And
Mhm.
that requires that we sort of give up the way we want to privatize money, that we are able to talk about it as a family, church family. But I think that the churches, we need to take care of each other. I mean, we're already going to start seeing, especially small businesses, I'm already seeing and hearing anecdotally, just can't make payroll, already. Especially if you own anything in the retail sector, restaurants, I mean, hotels, I mean, anything, those people, their livelihood is going away very quickly. And so I think the church has an opportunity to provide for those needs. But again, it requires that those of us who are working are tithing. And because the money isn't going to come out of thin air,
Right.
we have to do, again, this comes back to covenant. Like it's not that we don't have a job to do. It's just that we realize that it's the Spirit of God that allows us to do that job well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tithe is a means by which we, in our surplus, are able to provide for each other in our need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's really good. I also, just work with a lot of churches, and times like this, sometimes your larger givers are the business owners that may decide to skip some paychecks themselves
Mm-hmm.
just so they can pay their
Yep.
hourly people, for example. And
Absolutely.
it really needs to be something that's not just the larger givers, but everybody's giving. And
Right.
if you are on salary, it is a great time to say, okay, how are we going to up what we can give in order to care for people, either through the tithe and through the church, which is always wise because it's tends to be filtered and have some leadership over where those monies go.
Right.
But also just your neighbor or people that you're aware of in need that are going to be, there's a whole about to be a whole new under-resourced group, at the next paycheck
That's
that
right.
normally have a little bit more resources than what we typically are built as a system and structure to take care of. So
That's right.
anything else you want to share with us today? By the way, feel free to type out your questions before we wrap out on the chat, or you can unmute yourself in a minute. But Jared, is there anything else you want to share with us today that's come on your mind?
No, I mean, I would recommend reading. Maybe we can link to Brueggemann's book in the notes. It's a really accessible read. I think a lot of this goes back to our theology and who we believe God to be. And if we have made God in our own image, it is likely that we will be acting out of Pharaoh's economy. And that impacts not just our money. It impacts the way we treat people in all areas of our life. So I think when I did the teaching in Sunday school class, I mentioned this, the parable in Mark, or not the parable, but the story in Mark, was a reference, Mark 5, when Jesus is going to Jairus's house to heal his daughter, and Jairus is this, elite ruler of his day, and then the woman who's been afflicted for 12 years with some sort of bleeding symptom or whatever comes and just says, if I can just touch Jesus's robe, then he will heal me. And that story to me, I heard somebody preaching on that a couple years ago, an Anglican priest out of South Africa, and it was just phenomenal the way she brought me into the place of Jesus in that moment was serving both Jairus and this woman and bringing them into the same place as the people of God. So he could have very easily ignored the woman and gone to the elite ruler, as that's the way the whole society was set up, that we prioritize the people at the top of the ladder. But he instead stopped. He stopped in the middle of the whole throng and said, "Who is that who touched me?" And he gave her dignity. He gave her, a name of daughter. And that, to me, that is sort of an embodiment of this whole Pharaoh versus Yahweh idea, is that Jesus embodied the whole thing. He doesn't say that Pharaoh is not worthy of my love. He doesn't say that people who are caught up in Pharaoh's economy aren't worthy of my healing and my saving grace. But what he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do is play the game. He says everybody is made in the image of God. And this woman who's been unclean for 12 years hasn't had even a hint. She's been social distance for 12 years. I mean, that came to me. Like, what is it like if you're a woman in the first century who's unclean in a Jewish context? Like, you're not hanging out with anybody ever. And Jesus has, in a moment, turned that whole thing upside down. And I think that's I mean, clearly we're not going to do that as well as Jesus, but to hold Jesus up as the example of and the enabler to us to actually say, well, what are the ways where I can not rush off to the elite gyruses of the world just because they're elite, but to actually care for both the elite and the sort of underclass at the same time through what God has given me. That's what I think we have to wrestle with. We have to be imaginative and creative enough to do that as a church.
Yeah, because, you can certainly think about how, like, a lot of times that, when we ourselves, I mean, who we identify with, we identify not too very frequently in times like this as under-resourced,
Right.
and I mean, we're the one that doesn't deserve grace,
That's
and
right.
we're the one that gets it. And
right.
because we get it, also that does is motivate us to continue to give grace and continue to be generous.
That's right.
That's good. That's good. That's good. One thing that, of course, came out to me when I was thinking about that is just thinking about how God uses finances and scarcity to deliver us, to redeem us from the slavery of performance.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that came out. I think redemption, the word redemption right there, before they leave Egypt, and the word salvation is the first time it's used in the Bible. That those words are there, and it's because of these economic systems that are starting to show that they fail.
Right.
And God, in the middle of that, to show that He really uses our finances to bring out our heart. Boy,
That's
does
right.
He ever. So that's another thing that came to mind.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us and taking your time out of your lunch hour. What is the name of the book, just real quick? I will put it in the notes, but Brueggemann,
the name of Brueggemann's book is called Money and Possessions. It was written in a series. I don't know who published it, but it's super good, and it's very accessible. It's not like I would guess it's probably 150 pages. It's not like an academic book. He just does a great job of expositing the text. He wrote one on Sabbath, I think, called Sabbath as Resistance or whatever, but that inherently talks a lot about economics as well. So those are two great ones. There's also a book that came out in the last year or so called Kingdom Economics, I think, but it was written by Michael Rhodes and with the guy who wrote When Helping Hurts and some other guys out of Tennessee. So there's a lot of good resources out there. Not as many as there should be, I don't think, but there's a lot of good ones out there.
Yeah, and I happen to have that one. Here. It was probably the best read I had last year. It was excellent.
So good.
This is Michael Rhodes and Robbie Holtz, one in Chattanooga, the other one's in Memphis, I think. No, they're both in Chattanooga. And Practicing the King's Economy is fantastic. I'll put those down in the notes below the post today as we wrap up. Let me just wrap us up in a word of prayer.
Great.
Heavenly Father, I thank you so much just for your scripture and your reminder through your word that you're going to take care of us. And I thank you so much for Jared's study of this and insight that we've had from other people in the body of Christ to help us just remind us that you are in charge and that we don't have to operate out of fear, that with you we get to operate out of love. And through these times where where we're challenged. Thank you so much for bringing out our hearts, both in our checkbook, but also in our anxiety or emotions, that we would be able to see who we are really serving. Help us receive your grace, that we don't do anything to be delivered, but you do it because of Christ. And because of the deliverance that he brings us, that you teach us, even in times where there's perceived scarcity, but help us see, Father, open our eyes to see how you give and give and give and give, so that we can do that as well. Thank you so much for our time. I pray that every single person on this call would be generous. And as we continue that conversation, I pray that you would help us do some from a place that is centered upon you and your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Gotcha. It was fun.